If you look at a satellite image of the Yukon or Northern California today, you will see something disturbing. Slashing through the green valleys are miles of grey, snake-like scars. They look like the trails of a giant prehistoric worm that burrowed through the earth, leaving nothing but dead stone in its wake. These are not natural formations. They are the footprints of a machine. For 50 years, the quiet wilderness of the north was dominated by a sound so loud it could be heard 6 miles away. It was a screeching, grinding roar that never stopped. It was the sound of a 3,000-ton factory floating in a pond of its own making, eating the landscape alive. The locals called them gold ships. But to the men who served aboard them, they were deafening, dangerous iron beasts. This is the story of the Bucket Line Dredge, the machine that drank the rivers dry, processed millions of tons of earth, and spat out fortunes in pure gold, leaving a wasteland behind. The image of the gold rush is usually a bearded man, with a mule and a pan, sifting through a creek. That is the romantic version. But by the early 1900s, the romance was dead. The easy gold, the nugget sitting in the stream, was long gone. What remained was placer gold, tiny flakes hidden deep in the frozen gravel, sometimes 50 feet below the mud. No human hand could reach it. The ground was frozen solid. The volume of dirt was too massive. To get this gold, the mining companies didn't need men. They needed an industrial solution. They needed a way to process the entire valley, stone by stone. Engineers looked at the problem and designed a monster. They combined the hull of a ship, the excavating power of a steam shovel, and the processing plant of a factory. The result was the Bucket Line Dredge. It was a creature of paradox. It was a ship that didn't sail on the sea. It sailed through solid ground. Here is how it worked. The dredge sat in a man-made pond. As it dug the earth in front of it, it moved forward. As it dumped the waste rock behind it, it filled the pond back in. It literally carried its own ocean with it, crawling across the valley floor at a speed of 1/2 mile per month. Let's step aboard this floating fortress and look at the anatomy of destruction. At the bow of the ship was the gantry, a massive steel crane holding the bucket line. This was the mouth of the beast, an endless rotating chain of manganese steel buckets, each weighing nearly 2 tons. On the largest dredges, like the legendary Dredge No. 4 in the Klondike, each bucket could hold 16 cubic feet of earth. That is the size of a modern refrigerator, filled with solid rock every few seconds. Driven by massive electric motors, sometimes powered by hydroelectric dams built specifically for the dredge, this chain would tear into the riverbed. The buckets were designed to be virtually indestructible, but the violence of the digging was intense. They scraped the bedrock, ripping up boulders the size of cars, churning up ancient mud, and carrying it all up into the belly of the ship. The sound of this operation was apocalyptic, metal shrieking against stone. In 1910, safety regulations did not exist. There was no hearing protection. The crews lived in a world of permanent vibration and noise. They communicated by throwing rocks at each other to get attention, because shouting was useless. Once the earth was swallowed, it had to be digested. The buckets dumped their load into the main hopper at the top of the ship. From there, gravity took over. The material fell into the trommel. Imagine a rotating steel cylinder, 40 feet long and 8 feet wide, spinning constantly like the drum of a nightmare washing machine. Inside the trommel, high-pressure water jets blasted the gravel. The noise here was even worse than outside, thousands of rocks tumbling inside a steel drum. The trommel acted as a sieve. The big rocks, the waste, tumbled out the end. But the gold, which is heavy and small, fell through 1/2-inch holes in the screen. This material landed on the gold tables. These were sloping sluice boxes lined with riffles, obstacles designed to trap heavy particles. But water wasn't enough to catch the finest gold dust. The engineers used chemistry. They poured mercury, quicksilver, onto the tables. Mercury has a chemical affinity for gold. It grabbed the tiny flakes and bound them into a heavy grey sludge called amalgam. Every week the dredge would shut down for clean-up day. The crew would scrape the mercury gold paste off the tables and heat it in a furnace. The mercury would boil off, leaving behind a sponge of pure yellow gold. It was a process of alchemy on an industrial scale. One of the most fascinating mechanical features of the dredge was how it moved. It didn't have a propeller, it had legs. These were called spuds. At the rear of the ship, two massive steel pillars called spuds hung vertically. They were pointed like spears. When the dredge was working, one spud was dropped deep into the riverbed, acting as a pivot point. The dredge would swing side to side on cables, carving an arc in the earth. When it was time to move forward, the operator would drop the second spud and lift the first, literally walking the 3,000-ton ship forward one step at a time. It was a slow, lumbering walk, but it was unstoppable. Trees, cabins, and old stream beds were simply consumed by the forward march of the spuds. Operating this machine was a dance with death. The machinery inside the hull was exposed. Giant gears the size of wagon wheels spun in the open air. Massive drive belts whipped through the corridors. The most dangerous job belonged to the oiler. His task was to walk among the moving machinery with an oil can, lubricating the hundreds of bearings while the dredge was running. The floors were slippery with grease and mud. One slip, one loose piece of clothing caught in a gear, and the man would be pulled into the machine. There was no emergency stop button. In the Yukon, the cold added another layer of lethality. In November, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The steel became brittle. The bucket pins could snap like glass, sending tons of metal crashing onto the deck. The pond itself tried to freeze. The crews had to fight a constant battle against the ice, using steam hoses and breaking the surface to keep the dredge floating. If the pond froze solid, the hull could be crushed like an eggshell. The most famous of these giants, Dredge No. 4, unearthed 9 tons of gold in its lifetime. In today's value, that is over $500 million. But the cost of that gold is written on the land. At the back of every dredge was the stacker. This was a long conveyor belt that took the clean rocks, the waste, and piled them up behind the ship. This is what created the worm tracks. The dredge took a complex, living ecosystem, a river valley with soil, trees, and fish, and turned it into a sterile pile of rocks. Nothing grows on the tailings piles. Even today, 100 years later, the valleys near Dawson City and Nome look like the surface of the moon. The gold was extracted, sent to banks in London and New York, and the land was left broken. By the 1950s, the era of the gold ship began to end. The price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce, but the cost of labor and electricity was rising. One by one, the monsters were shut down. Some caught fire and burned to the waterline. Some simply sank into the mud they had dug. Others were abandoned where they stood, silent sentinels in the valleys. Today, you can visit Dredge No. 4, now a National Historic Site in Canada. It sits on dry land, a rusting monument to engineering genius. But if you look closely at the rusted buckets and the silent gears, you can almost hear the ghost of the sound. The screeching roar that once terrified the wildlife and signaled the arrival of the industrial age in the wilderness. The Bucket Line Dredge was the ultimate expression of man's desire for wealth. It was efficient, it was powerful, and it was absolutely ruthless. Thanks for watching Titan Hall. If you enjoyed this history of heavy metal and gold fever, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. These machines destroyed nature to build the economy. Was the gold worth the destruction of the landscape? See you in the next one.